predatory lending, which helped spark the crisis. Once the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was created, President Obama asked her to be its first head, but when Senate Republicans refused to confirm her, she then ran for the Senate instead, where she continues to focus on these issues. Here to interview her tonight is our expert on the genesis of that crisis. He wrote the best-selling book, Too Big to Fail, which was later adapted into a movie. He's a financial columnist for the paper and founder and editor of DealBook, a financial news service published by the New York Times. So please welcome my colleague, Andrew Ross Sorkin, and our guest, Senator Elizabeth Warren.
Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Senator, for being here. It is a privilege to speak with you 10 years after the financial crisis. Yep. And I think it would not be a stretch to say that your political career, to some degree, was born in the financial crisis.
Born of misery. That's a great thought.
There is so much to cover and to think about in terms of the financial world and the political world and where we are today. And so I want to start the conversation this way. You are a former professor. Mm-hmm. I spent yesterday interviewing Hank Paulson, Tim Geithner, and Ben Bernanke, who was a former professor. Mm-hmm. And I said to him, grade yourself and grade the performance of the recovery. That was the question I asked him. So I'm going to now, and I'll tell you what he said in a moment, but I'm going to ask you to grade the performance of the policies and the recovery that we've had over the past decade.
So can we do this as just good, bad?
Well, sure.
Okay. So
were you were a pass-fail kind of person?
Never. So the way I see this, though, is it really is. You do have to do this in kind of the good and the bad. The good is the entire worldwide economy did not go crashing ultimately off a cliff, and we're not back in the Stone Age, which I remember the moments when some people thought that was exactly where we were headed. But the bad news is we put in place a structure that, by and large, sent a message to the biggest guys on Wall Street, and that is, if you're big and you take on risks and it all blows up in your face, you get backed up by the American taxpayer. And here's the key part. There is no personal responsibility for you. None of these bankers, no matter what they were engaged in, no matter what the fraud was, no matter what the deception was, no matter how much failure to disclose or failure to abide by the rules there was, every single one of them, to the extent penalties were paid, they were paid by the company. And everybody learned the lesson. And watch how that lesson played out with Wells Fargo. They get caught breaking the law, right? Just plain old-fashioned breaking the law. And what do? They pay a fine, sign some promises, and break it again. Get caught, break the law again, get caught, break the law again. How many cycles are we on right now with Wells Fargo? Again, without anybody ever being held responsible. And if you don't have accountability in a capitalist system, then the whole thing breaks down. Because it truly does mean these guys get all the profits on the upside and shift all the risks to someone else on the downside.
Okay, so but let me just ask you about the counterfactual. Okay. What didn't happen?
Fair enough.
Or what could have happened?
Right.
One of the things that people talk about, and you have talked about, is trying to help homeowners and individuals more directly. That's where the money could have or should have gone.
Yep.
But the question becomes, when you look at where the economy is today, and I think by all measures, and look, it's remarkably uneven, so I don't want to suggest that it was a supreme effort, but clearly I think we'd all agree that the economy is in a much better place, perhaps than we even deserve today. Was that strategy of putting the money into the banks the wrong one?
Wait a minute. You're talking about counterfactual. I don't think we're even in the factual yet. What does this economy look like right now? You're right. Great GDP, unemployment is low, corporate profitability, bank profitability, record-breaking. How about the median earning family?
Oh, no question.
Well, no question. That is the economy in America. What's happened to all those families in the middle, all those families a little below the middle that are trying to pull up, all those families just a little above the middle? Not only is it the case that their income, adjusted for inflation, the big great news is they're maybe back to where they were in 2007. They're facing lifetime consequences from this crash that are estimated at, $70,000 annual or over a lifetime for these folks. But at the same time that all their costs have gone up, the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing, and their total wealth, because that was what was right in the middle of this crisis. Their homeownership rates way down, and wealth is down for these families. So the idea that this is a fabulous economy, I'm going to put it this way. It is truly a fabulous economy for billionaires, for multimillionaires, woohoo. But for folks kind of in that whole big hump in the middle, I'm afraid I'm not with you. I don't think that's the lived experience of much of America.
But I think there's two issues here. One is what was the policy response in the immediate aftermath of the crisis.
Yep.
And then there's this larger issue about what might be described as systemic, real economic issues in this country that I would argue were actually masked for a very long time by debt, which led to the crisis.
I've actually made that argument, so we're together.
So why have we not spent enough time on those issues?
Because Washington works for the wealthy and the well-connected, not for working families. I mean, that's how it is.
So but part of the question embedded in that question is when you think about globalization taking jobs, and we can talk about trade, and I want to talk about trade with you. And when you think about stagnating wages, and when you think about the number of workers that weren't in the workforce, when you look at the policies in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, had people been allowed to do principal reduction or some of the other things you talked about?
And held on to their homes.
Do you think it would have worked? Because and by the way, there's lots of debate about whether it would have worked because if people didn't have jobs, they wouldn't have ultimately been able to pay the mortgage that they would have had to pay later. Would it have worked? And B, where would we be today instead? That's what I'm very curious about.
So, look, the answer is yes, I think it would have worked, and I think we would have a stronger working class, middle class in America right now, and more opportunity for those who are trying to make it into the middle class. But I think the real picture, and I think this is actually what you were driving at a second ago, I think it's a larger push across this. So can we do this? So start with 1790s.
Okay. We've only got 50 minutes, but yes.
That's okay. I figure a decade a minute, we can make it through this. Okay, so start in the 1790s, first big crash for this new country. And basically, roughly every about 15 years, right? What happens is the economy gets better, the economy gets better, the economy gets better, the economy gets great, and then bang, the economy crashes. And the problem, of course, is that when it crashes, it doesn't just take down the speculators. It takes down the farmers, and it takes down the small shopkeepers, and it takes down employees. It takes down a lot of people who didn't get wealthy on the climb, but sure end up in the ditch when it all goes down. There were many people in the United States and around the world who believed that cycle in an economy was it was like gravity, right? You pick this thing up and drop it, it's going to fall. It takes 15 years, but roughly 10 to 20, but that's what's going to happen. The big one hits in the 1930s, and Franklin Roosevelt says, we can do better than this. And then he does these incredibly bold things. So he says, we'll make it safe to put money in banks, right? FDIC insurance. We'll put a watchdog on Wall Street, the SEC. We will break up the big financial institutions, Glass-Steagall, right? And we will enforce antitrust laws much more vigorously than we have. So what happens? 1935 to 1980. Oh, by the way, let me throw in one more thing. And we'll do really progressive income tax and make the investments then in education, in infrastructure, in basic research. 1935 to 1980, you want to dance the GDP? Right? It does that, right? It does that. But here's the deal. Everybody not in the top 10%, the 90% of America, They get 70% of all that new income growth. That is when America builds the great middle class. Labor is strong, unions are growing, it's happening.
Right.
1980,
yes.
Pivot point.
Yes.
What happens in 1980, right? So we see a shift,
yes.
right? And what happens? The first part is deregulate. So they still leave FDIC insurance in place, fire the cops, not the cops on Main Street, the cops on Wall Street, right? Start pecking holes in Glass-Steagall till you knock it down at the end of the 90s. Pull in the regulators, way dial down on antitrust enforcement, and what happens? GDP keeps going right on up. It dips in 2008, obviously, but it comes back up. It recovers. Where's the big difference? The big difference is the 90% of America. Remember, they'd gotten 70% of all new income growth, 1935
yes.
to 1980. 1980 to 2016, you know the answer for how much they get. Zero. Nothing.
Where does globalization come into this, though?
So globalization comes into this in terms of what we require of the corporations that are making this money. You know, workers are part of why this economy keeps going up. There is a time, 1935 to 1980, where workers share. Your company does better, the stockholders do better, the executives do better, and the workers do better. What happens starting roughly in 1980, a little before, a little after, the workers flatten out. And as GDP keeps going up, those at the top just keep sweeping up more and more of the money. The thing about globalization that gets me, and we can talk about it in terms of trade, what happens, and whether you're investing in workers, whether or not they're participating in the productivity that they are helping produce, it's not simply a question of whether or not there's cheaper labor in China or somebody in Ireland could do some of this work. It's the policies that we follow right here in the United States. They deal with progressive taxation, and they also deal with what the corporate rules are. So, as you know, this is part of the reason that I've introduced a new bill. I'll just slip in the commercial for it, called Accountable Capitalism. Now let's watch to see whose hair's set on fire.
Let me ask you about accountable capitalism, since you went there.
Okay.
And by the way, there were a number of tweets. There were a number of tweets that were sent this afternoon. After you sent out a tweet saying we're going to have this conversation.
Yes.
That said you need to ask her about whether she is a socialist. And I went and I'd seen this.
Ask me.
You have said before that you have said before that you are a capitalist to my bones, and at other times you said I'm a capitalist to my ankles.
No, I think it was to my toes. Ankles?
What do you think that means? And how does it differ than the perception out there?
Well, I don't know about the perception. I mean, I don't know who tweeted you. I don't know who follows you. But
Ooh.
But I meant that in a nice way. I just mean I don't know who those people are. But I believe in markets. I believe in the value that markets produce. Look, I taught contract law for most of my grown-up life. I taught corporate law and corporate finance. I taught bankruptcy. When you teach contracts and bankruptcy, you teach the alpha and omega of the financial system, right? How you put it together and what you do when it all blows up, right? And how you take it back apart. Because on the very first day of contract law, I used to sell, this shows you, I'm dating this. I used to wear a watch, and I would sell my watch on the first day. And some kid would buy it for $20. And then we did the whole point around what was the watch worth to the buyer? And somebody always falls for it and says $20. And the answer is no. It's worth more than $20. Could it have been, but all we know is a choice between a $20 bill and a watch. They picked the watch. That watch could be worth 21 or 40 or 90 or 1,000. And same thing to me. What do you know the watch was worth to me? And the answer is it was worth something less than $20. And I say that only by way of saying, emphasizing markets create value. And the fact that we have enforceable contract law and corporate law is valuable not only individually, but valuable to this country to build a strong economy. People can make contract promises and know that you have courts that will enforce them. And that permits them to make all kinds of adjustments and promises and trades way out into the future. I love markets, but markets have to have rules, and markets need to be about competition.
Okay, I want to talk about all of that.
Oh,
and I still want to talk about the crisis for just a moment more, and then we will get to where capitalism is failing or succeeding, depending on what side of this you may very well be. I do want to ask you this, though. Mm-hmm. People often say 10 years later, are we any safer after this crisis? You look around, you say to yourself, we're in a better place, a worse place, we could have another crisis like this tomorrow?
We're in a different place, and I'm worried about the place we're in. I'm worried about the place we're in because of what is happening to working families. Look, parts of it are better. Can we stop and do a real congratulations around Dodd-Frank, and particularly around the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? We will not have another crisis of exactly the kind that produced the one of 2008. That one started one lion, cheat, and mortgage at a time, where big financial institutions figured out that they could trick people, they could trap people, they could defraud people, and get them to sign on these mortgages, things that were going to be enormously upfront profitable to those who placed the mortgages and those who packaged them and those who sold them. But it was like selling grenades with the pins pulled out, and those guys knew it, and they sold them anyway. So now we have in America 10 years post-crisis. This goes back to where you started a minute ago. We have in America 10 years post-crisis in which there are fewer homeowners. There's $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. There are families who are now 10 years in with no raises, people working 2 jobs, all the way through this economy. A once strong middle class. An America where one job would support a family and actually permit them to carry small amounts of debt and put away a substantial amount of their after-tax income in savings. That America has disappeared and left behind an America where people work harder and harder and harder and take on more and more risk. Families live one bad diagnosis, one pink slip away from financial calamity. And they know it, and they read every headline that says, economy great, and they think, what the hell happened to my family? And they are right to ask that question, because America's government has failed them.
Let me ask you, you mentioned the CFPB.
I did.
This was your creation. And this is Mick Mulvaney on the CFPB. We are still Elizabeth Warren's child, he says. As long as we're identified with that one person, we'll never be taken as seriously as a regulator as we should.
Oh. I don't think the problem that Mick Mulvaney's trying to solve is they're not taken seriously as a regulator. I think the problem is that the CFPB was taken pretty damn seriously as a regulator. Rich Cordry did a great job running the CFPB. You know, I just want to remind everybody about the CFPB. Put in place as part of Dodd-Frank, and giant kudos to the President of the United States, Barack Obama, who fought to keep that agency in Dodd-Frank and made sure it was there to protect the American people. And it basically had one goal, to say, big banks don't get to cheat people. And it gave this agency the tools to do that. And what happened? That agency returned more than $12 billion directly to people who had been cheated. It's handled more than 1.5 million complaints. It's brought record fines against big banks that have cheated people. That's government that works for the people. And I think that's why Mick Mulvaney doesn't like it.
Let me ask you.
Got you there.
You've made comments about big banks for a very long time. Would you break them up today?
Oh, yeah.
You still would?
Give me a chance. You bet. Are you offering? Glass-Steagall. Come on. John McCain and I introduced, along with Angus King and Maria Cantwell, introduced a 21st century Glass-Steagall. We've reintroduced it. And it basically just says, hey, build a wall between ordinary, boring banking, checking account, savings account banking, and investment banking, much riskier banking. Keep those two separated. And by the way, can I just point out, Glass-Steagall's central feature, 1935 to 1980 and beyond, until the thing crashed, we didn't have any economic crashes. That 15-year thing I was talking about before stopped.
So we've had this debate before.
Yes, we have.
And I asked you, you remember, I was on the phone with you, this is probably in 2009 or 10, there was a big debate about Glass-Steagall at that time. And I said to you, do you think that the financial crisis would have happened if Glass-Steagall hadn't been repealed?
That's not exactly how I remember the question. No, it's not, actually. And you may be right, you may have your records here, but the way I remember this is, would it by itself? And my view at that point was, we got to have a consumer agency, because we actually have to stop people from figuring out that they can make profits by cheating consumers. That is a bad place for our financial services area to be. And that was, in my view, what built it up. But I do believe that Glass-Steagall and the collapse, the repeal of Glass-Steagall had a lot to do with the financial crisis.
Is it just Glass-Steagall, or is it the size of these institutions? When you look at a J.P. Morgan today, or you look at the size of a Bank of America or a Wells Fargo, many of them now twice the size they were in 2008. Is it the size itself or what they're doing inside?
It's yes and yes.
Yes and yes.
It's both. And so let me put it this way. So, because I remember your comeback to me was to say Bear Stearns, right? Because after all, Bear Stearns was not a bank. Bear Stearns is the first one that collapses, then Merrill collapses. You know, why do you think Glass-Steagall would have made a difference? And pause to think about it this way. When you've got Glass-Steagall in place, what does banking look like? It's boring. Think about it. It's low risk, but low profit. That's the whole idea. It's low, steady profits that just keep coming. And by the way, how do you think about lending? You think about lending, can you actually repay this, right? That's the basic deal. Investment banking has, I'll just call it, a normally distributed curve. There's some very low risk stuff that has some low yield. There's some medium-ish risk stuff that has some medium-ish return. And there's some high risk stuff that has some very high return. When you knock down Glass-Steagall, and why do you knock down Glass-Steagall? We need to ask that. Why would you ever even do this? Not only do the banks get much bigger, which gives them all kinds of economic influence and too big to fail and political influence, but the second thing that happens is it changes the distribution of what these markets look like. So the banks hang on to all the banking stuff and all those assets, and they move over and start sucking up, because they are banks, of that normally distributed curve, the more conservative, lower yield for investment banking, but higher yield for banking into the spectrum. By the time you get to a Bear Stearns is no longer playing in a normally distributed curve. It's playing out in a high risk end of the curve, because it's competing with those banks that have changed the whole shape of the market for a Bear Stearns. Same thing for Merrill Lynch. So they keep making the riskier and riskier bets, and yet they're big, until they bring down the whole economy.
Let me ask you a question about size and scale and capitalism today.
Okay.
For the past 10 years, we've been talking about banks. But in the last 2 years, I would contend we've started to talk about Silicon Valley and some of the big tech giants. You've talked about the big tech giants. In fact, at one point, I think you talked about Google, Apple, and Amazon.
In the same speech?
All in the same speech?
That's right. More people's hair set on fire.
Would you break up the big tech companies today?
Well, the question is less to me about breaking up and more about what it is they do that is anti-competitive. I mean, yes, size worries me all by itself, and there's all kinds of data out there showing the implications of size on things like wages and so on. But I want to focus on a different part of this. So you look at someone like Amazon, and Amazon plays two ways in a marketplace. So Amazon says, we'll provide the marketplace, and you can click on that you want a Spiffy-Doo blender,
right?
And you'll get 15 Spiffy-Doo blenders. You can click on that you want a blue dress, and you get blue dress. And they provide that marketplace. At the same time, they're scraping all this information about Andrew Ross Sorkin, and he buys blue shirts on twice a month, and he seems to buy them on Tuesdays. And all of a sudden, they decide, whatever it is you like to buy, that they decide, because they got your number, they decide the next time he clicks on that it looks like the right place in the algorithm, they're not going to be the provider, they're not going to be the platform, they're going to be the competitor. And so they slip in and use this additional information to sell to you. And the problem is, I'm somebody else who wants to compete in this marketplace. I've been selling Sorkin shirts for a long time, or at least somebody, and I've been competing on price, I've been competing on quality, I've been competing on all the things that produce the benefits of markets, but Amazon gets this special information advantage that it then exploits to wipe out my business. That is a serious problem.
And so that's very interesting. So President Trump has a problem with Jeff Bezos, and you do too.
We must be twins.
Bernie Sanders as well.
Whoa, triplets. Okay.
What would you do? What would you do with Amazon?
Given
how you just articulated that.
Look, for me, it's a lot like Glass-Steagall. You got to pick one business or the other, baby. So, you want to be a competitor, be a competitor. That's great. You want to be the platform provider, that is a different function. And if you're getting huge comparative advantage from being the platform provider because of all this information you keep scraping off, then we no longer have competition going on over on the dress manufacturers, shirt manufacturers, blender manufacturers side of the house. So again, I just keep going back to this point. I believe in markets, but I believe in markets where there's competition.
What would you do to Facebook?
Look, I think it's the same kind of, it's slightly different. I'm going to do Facebook more along the Equifax model line, because every time you've got to kind of look at the businesses and what their models are. And I think actually it's easier to see in Equifax. So here's Equifax. Equifax, it turns out, doesn't even take basic safety precautions. And what was the ultimate number? Was it 146 million people's data that was stolen, right? Social security numbers, right. Phone numbers, addresses, passport numbers. Okay. I don't have a choice as a consumer not to have Equifax be a credit rater of me. I just don't have that choice. It's not available to me. So that means we've got a problem in competition. So here's Equifax. They totally, by, I think, any measure, completely screw up, right? And indeed, the people who understand this, the true data nerds, the ones who are way beyond my nerdiness, say they should have seen this coming. Okay, this was negligent at best. Okay, and what happened to them? Have you noticed? Nothing.
Nothing.
Their stock has recovered, right?
And people still use the service. Why do you think
What do you mean they still use the service? I don't have any choice.
Which gets us back to Facebook.
Yes, and that's why I said it's the right analogy. So the question here on each one of these is how you deal. We're developing these new commodities. This is where Facebook is also like Amazon. The information is where the value is, right? It's not the platform. There's some value in that, but the real it's the information. And so taking information about people, pulling this information in, and then monetizing this information in an anti-competitive, in some cases, and way in which this market is not regulated, and when I say not regulated, I mean this in both senses of the word. It's not only not got government oversight in any meaningful sense, it doesn't have market discipline in any meaningful sense, because it's all happening outside the control and the purview of the person whose information is being scraped off. So I think all of them have got this fundamental question we got to start wrestling with right now. It's 21st century, it is upon us, that we have to wrestle with this question about these companies that aggregate and monetize data in ways that do not create viable markets and that have no accountability to the people whose data has actually just been taken.
Let me ask you a separate question.
Sure.
Really about the economy, but it might be a political question given the crisis. A lot of people look at the crisis and say that the crisis has led to the populist politics of the moment today. Some people have actually drawn a straight line between the crisis and the pain of that crisis, the anger and the bitterness and divide that created at the time, to President Trump's ascendance. What do you think of that idea?
I think there's some truth in it. Look, this is what we were talking about a minute ago. What do you say to people who worked hard, who played by the rules, to say, hey, remember that mortgage you signed? Well, it turned out back on page 15, they had never actually qualified you for this mortgage for more than 24 months, and they knew when they gave it to you that it had a 1 in 5 chance of blowing up and causing you to lose your home. They never explained, nobody ever showed you what this was going to mean, that you would have to refinance within 24 months and pay another huge amount of money, and that if you couldn't do that, you were actually going to lose your home. People, I guess the reason I always go back to this, I was with those families. I was with those people. I've sat next to people who worked hard, people who put everything they had into their families, just trying to make it all work, and who watched in that crisis. First, as it all blew up, and I've been with families when they were talking about what it was like to lose a job, what it's like that they're going to be foreclosed against, but then to turn around and watch the federal government say in TARP, passed during the Bush years, we're going to come in and we're going to bail out giant financial institutions, but there's no help for you. And then part 3, to turn around and watch the same financial institutions run by those same people get mega rich, get bigger, have higher profits. CEOs are getting bonuses measured not just in the millions of dollars, but the tens of millions of dollars. And they're picking up a second job and recognizing that they now look at their kids and say, I can't send you to school. You're going to end up having to borrow $40,000 a year in order to go to college. This is an America that no longer works for working families.
Let me just ask you, though, and the reason why I wanted to ask you about the populism, and because people talk about President Trump as a populist, you oftentimes hear that. But people also talk about you as a populist. And I want to read you. This is Cass Mudd, a professor at the University of Georgia. He wrote a book called Populism, a very short introduction. And this is how he defines populism. He said, populists are dividers, not uniters. They split society into 2 homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people on one end and the corrupt elite on the other. And they say they're guided by the will of the people. What do you think of that idea and that definition? How do you think about yourself relative to the president?
I think if I were rich, I would love that definition. Don't divide us, right? Just let the rich keep getting richer and everybody else get whatever is left over. I mean, that's what that definition is all about. I'll tell you what I think populism is. I think populism is to talk about the lived experience of working people, of of the rest of America, of the 90% of America that I was talking about earlier. And I thought that candidate Trump tapped in to a genuine anger, not a fake anger, a genuine anger. The place, though, that he then turned it is to say, you're right to be angry, but let me tell you who to blame. People who don't look like you, people who don't talk like you, people who don't worship like you. Those are the people you want to blame. I think we really need to hold our government accountable, and I think part of that accountability is to recognize we've put in place a set of rules and permitted the wealthy and the well-connected to keep working the system here in Washington so that it's accelerating. They just keep doing better and better and better while everyone else works harder and harder to try to break even. And that's just not going to be sustainable.
Well, then let me ask you a little political question, which is, where do you see yourself within the party, the Democratic Party today? Because you've made, let me read something. This is from New York Magazine, just this week. Elizabeth Warren is running on a progressive platform that, if enacted, would sharply curtail political and economic inequality. I think you're going to agree with this part. But unlike Sanders, she's building a profile designed to compete for swing voters also, rather than solely to inspire progressive activists. The distinction can be seen in her rhetoric, policy substance, and choice of emphasis. You know, there's been a real question about how the party is moving, shifting, whether it's moved left with Bernie Sanders on one side, where you are in that, and where the center is. What do you think of, how do you place yourself in this?
So why do this as party? Because I'll tell you where I place myself. I place myself right in the middle of America. When you look at core economic issues, where is America? About, 2 out of 3 Americans think we ought to raise the minimum wage. 3 out of 4 Americans, somewhere in there, think that young people shouldn't be crushed by student loan debt, that they ought to be able to get an education without having to take on this kind of debt, and that we ought to do something about outstanding debt. Where are we? I don't know, somewhere in the 60%, maybe more, of people who think we ought to expand Social Security. You kind of go through the core economic, where is America? And when I say America, I don't mean democratic America. I mean Democratic, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, Vegetarian America. You put them all together, and then you ask these core economic questions. There's only one question for which it's outside. These core economic questions are somewhere in the 60s or 70s. But the point is, well over half of America. The one that's not true for is greater regulation over Wall Street and the big banks. That one goes up into the 90s in terms of people across this country. So how I see this is a lot less about political parties and a lot more about where America is. There are issues on which we're divided. I understand that. But this core economic set of issues, stronger unions, I'll throw in one more, the importance of better labor rights. On these core economic issues, America is a progressive country.
Okay, so let me ask you. We are in 2018. You know where this question's going. There's something that's going to happen in 2020. This is Barney Frank, former Massachusetts congressman. Profile of you. This is what he said. She's much, much too smart to run for president.
Go, Barney. My guy. I love Barney. Barney's a good guy.
Are you too smart?
I'm running for Senate. 2018. You know, I will say.
What do you think of that?
You know, come on. Barney is always fun. But he really is. But what I think is that we're 54 days away from midterm elections. And I get really aggravated about the press. All wants to say, yeah, but can we talk about what happens every 4 years? This is an enormously consequential election coming up in 54 days. And boy, focus.
But do you think it's unfair to argue that you have shifted at all, even in the past year, in terms of where you have established yourself in the party, in the larger party, beyond what's going to happen in the next 54 days?
It sounds so. This is who I've been all along. I've never fooled anybody about how I feel about these core economic issues. Look, like I said, this is the stuff I taught, I wrote about. I've been writing about this stuff for 30 years. And I've been writing about exactly this set of economic issues. In fact, you want to hear about some of the most frustrating parts of my life? It's when I kept standing there saying, it's all going to crash. It's going to blow up. It's not going to work. And when it blows up, it's going to take down tens of millions of people. And you know what I had happen? I had more than one Wall Street guy, more than one academic guy just say, don't worry about it. We got this under control. Not going to happen. And the answer is it did happen. And what really gets to me is, yeah, it happened. And who paid the price for it? Hardworking families. Families like the family I grew up in. That's who paid the price for it. And who walked away richer than ever?
The bankers.
Yeah.
Well, by the way, talking about bankers, I was actually curious. I wanted to ask you. Just yesterday, Jamie Dimon was quoted saying that he believes that he could run against President Trump and win. So we could play Will You Rather.
I'm not voting for either one of those guys.
I have a handful of more questions, and I should tell you that a number of questions came in to us by Facebook and from you throughout this session, and so I want to get to them in a second. I did want to ask you, did you read the anonymous op-ed in the New York Times?
Sure. Is there anybody in America who didn't? And did I feel guilty the whole time? Totally, totally. But I ate a big cookie and just kept reading. Oh, yeah.
And you thought what?
Actually, when I read it, I got to the end, and of course, it's also the same time Bob Woodward's book is being talked about everywhere. It's just before it came out. And I got to the end, and I thought, whoa, wait a minute. So these guys, or gal, whoever wrote this thing, says, I think the president is not fit to do his job. And that's what gives me license to steal things off his desk and not follow direct orders. But I'm not going to step out and do what the Constitution says is the way to deal with this if the cabinet and close-in officials believe that the president is not capable of doing their job. And I thought, man, that's not how it's supposed to work in a democracy. Either you believe the president is capable of doing his job, in which case it may not be stuff you like. You could try to advise, you can try to persuade, but the president is the elected official. Or you believe the president is not capable of doing his job, in which case that's what the 25th Amendment was written for. And those people have a constitutional responsibility. You've got to be in one place or the other.
So the op-ed, as you know, created lots of debate with lots of questions about not only who the writer is, but the writer's responsibility and whether they should have effectively resigned and gone public on the record. What do you think?
Well, for me, it's less about resigning. Like I said, I'm really in this, you're in one place or the other. I truly, it cannot be that someone can say he's not capable, but so long as he's producing the tax cuts that we like and getting us to a place we like on trying to repeal health care, I'm going to keep him in that seat. And don't worry, American people, I'll keep him from doing other things that I don't like. Nobody elected whoever wrote that thing to do that. That's not the deal. So for me, this is less about resign and walk out and more about this person needs to get straight. Either you think the president is capable of doing his job or you don't.
Let me ask you a different question.
Sure.
Another business executive, Tom Steyer, has a campaign afoot to impeach the president.
Yeah.
Do you support Tom Steyer?
Nope.
You
Not
don't?
on this. No,
Have you
I
talked?
don't.
Have you talked to him about it?
Uh-huh.
What do you say?
Well, I'm not going to tell what he said. I'll only tell you what I said. So, look, I take this very seriously. This is something that could come to the House. This is obviously, if it does, it could come to the Senate. The way I see this is about letting the special prosecutor complete his investigation. We have an ongoing serious investigation. It has resulted in more than 24 indictments or guilty pleas already. And I want protection for the special prosecutor. Every time Donald Trump starts tweeting again or attacks somebody else in government, I get very worried about the special prosecutor. There's something we could do right now. We don't have to. We can let this go all the way to the end. The thing we could do right now is Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan could hold a vote, and the United States Congress could pass a law that says the special prosecutor Mueller cannot be fired by the President of the United States. The investigation then can be completed, and once the investigation is completed, then we know what we've got in front of us.
What do you think is going to happen?
I don't know. And I mean that. I really don't know.
Related question, and we got one on this, so I'm going to ask it. You proposed something called the Anti-Corruption and Public Integrity Act.
Yes.
Which I imagine would probably touch the Trump family, which is why I connected the dots. But let me ask you about this idea of lobbyists and people who work in industry and their ability to work in government and then their ability to work in industry.
I think it's called the revolving door.
Yes. Is there any value that you see, because you've made a very big deal of this, is there any value you see in the expertise of somebody, not necessarily a lobbyist, but somebody in industry coming into work in the government in some regulatory capacity? Is that a bad thing?
Of course not. I hired people when I set up the CFPB who had worked in industry. I had put my money, your money, where my mouth is on this. I have hired people from industry because they have expertise. But let's pause here for a minute. Expertise and public service. Expertise and some indication that they really do want to work in the public interest. What I object to are when people have only experience working on, say, Wall Street, and they want to move into government for a short period of time and regulate their former and soon-to-be future employer and then zip back through. Gary Cohn. Can we talk Gary Cohn?
Let's talk about Gary Cohn.
Let's talk Gary Cohn. Okay, so Gary Cohn works at Goldman all those years, then moves over to the Trump administration. He's going to have exactly one thing in his portfolio, and that is cram through a new tax law, right? Drive through a new tax law. So what does Goldman Sachs do for Gary Cohn on the way out the door? They hand over somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 million to Gary Cohn in money they didn't have to release. And, you know, you might reasonably ask, would they have done that if he'd done Teach for America? If he'd said, I'm going to go write the great American novel, would they have done that? You know, I just kind of have a doubt about that. But so here's the deal. Gary Cohn, I think of this kind of money as you leave Wall Street to go into government.
According to Bob Woodward, he saved America by taking that paper off of the president's desk.
There you go. I think of it as that money as a pre-bribe. So Gary Cohn picks up these sacks full of money, goes into government, and rewrites the tax laws, manages to cram it through, and boy, did Goldman once again show. Savvy investor. In the first quarter, the tax breaks that Cohn pushed through saved Goldman Sachs more than $250 million. And now it will be the gift that keeps on giving. And here's the deal. Think how that feels to the American people. Think how that feels to somebody who gets out there and, busts her tail and works 40 hours a week and picks up another 6 hours doing part-time work. And she looks up and says, so let me understand this. This guy works at Goldman. He gets $250 million. And then I just want to understand, when he's drawing a paycheck from the American people, is he actually working for us, or is he still working for Goldman, or just working for himself?
Let me ask you, do you genuinely believe that Gary Cohn was making tax policy on behalf of Goldman Sachs? You may have the answer. No.
You asked me what I believe.
Yes.
So this goes back to this question. You asked me about expertise. Gary Cohn's worldview, as best we could tell from the outside, I am not his psychiatrist, but as best we can tell from the outside, is Goldman Sachs. And he comes straight from Goldman Sachs. He doesn't make a detour through Teach for America.
Correct.
He comes straight from Goldman Sachs into government to write tax laws that will affect Goldman Sachs.
100%.
And
I'm not suggesting his worldview is not completely built by his experience at Goldman Sachs.
Then what is your question?
Well, no, but the question is whether you think that he came to Washington to do the bidding of Goldman. That was the entire purpose of his tour here in Washington.
Look, all I know is he sees the world from, as best I can tell, from the perspective of Goldman Sachs. And what's good for Goldman Sachs, right, is good. And let me just be clear, I don't have to peer into his brain. I see what he did. What he did was help Goldman Sachs. And what it means to somebody else out there who's working her tail off and doesn't have that kind of opportunity, who looks at a tax bill that gave away $1.5 trillion to giant corporations and to billionaires and says, wait a minute, I didn't get that. I didn't have the chance to go into government and write the rules to say, hey, let's help people who live in the house I live in. Instead, that all went to Gary Cohn. Gary Cohn, who's sitting on $250 million courtesy of Goldman Sachs. I think if that lady who's working hard every day is a little skeptical about Gary Cohn's judgment under those circumstances, that's pretty fair.
Okay, let me ask you this. This is John Russell. He's on Facebook. He says, what do you propose, this goes to the Equifax question. What do you propose to do about the credit reporting system in this country after the Equifax breach? What would you do?
So for openers, this is one of these where you just have to admit markets don't work in the usual way, like we were talking about.
So you shut the company down?
No. What you do is you just put strict liability in place. So the first time they lose somebody's data, it costs them so much money. How about $150 for the first piece of data they lose of yours, and so much for every piece of data after that, multiplied by how many people they've got, up to a cap of half of the revenues of the company for the year. And it's strict liability. So it's a question of you lose the data, you're going to pay. And if you do that, I'll bet they take a lot of care with those data, a lot more than they did before.
Okay, another question. This specifically has to do with this idea of short-termism.
Oh, by the way, I have a bill on that, too, with Mark Warner. It's a good bill. We have a bill.
Question about short-termism in terms of the investment market. You've talked a lot about this issue. President Trump recently talked about this issue and suggested that maybe the government should study the idea that public companies, should only report twice a year. What do you think of that?
I don't think it fixes the problem.
What do you think does fix the problem? Giving you the opportunity.
I happen to have a bill here.
I know you do.
It's called accountable capitalism, okay? And this is really the heart of what accountable capitalism is about. There was a time, look, in corporate law, when corporations took account of multiple stakeholders. And how do I know this? I know this because the Business Roundtable, which is all the biggest corporations in America, the real giants, put out a statement of what corporations do. I think this is like 1981, right? And they said corporations take account of They take account of their employees, their shareholders, the communities they're located in, their customers, right? And they try to accommodate all these interests. And by the late 1990s, the Business Roundtable says, nah, corporations have just one job. And that one job is to shovel cash, money, it may not be cash, directly into the pockets of their shareholders. That is their only job. And what happened in America during that time period? This is what we've talked about from the beginning. So before 1980, when corporations do well, employees do well, communities do well, right? We're all doing better. We're building a stronger middle class. Consumers do better. You're building markets. It's working. You start in the 1980s as corporations make this shift, and employees, communities get left behind. So what I propose with accountable capitalism is to say, look, we got to shift this around. So part of it says that CEOs have to hold on to their stock for a 5-year period. So they can't just juice the stock and sell out. A second one says if they're going to do buyouts, which are just, inject sugar into the price of the stock because it doesn't change anything else, they can't sell for at least 3 years after a buyout, trying to get them focused a little more long arc. And part of it, as I said, how about letting employees elect 40% of the board? So big decisions. We're going to have some other people in the room to talk about it. And the last one says, and if you're going to make political contributions, then you need 75% approval. You've got to be public with your board about this and have the board make the decision before you do it. This applies to corporations that have $1 billion or more in revenue. These are big corporations that have enormous power in our economy. Look, we've been chartering corporations forever and putting conditions on those charters. I think we need to put some more conditions to force corporations to make more long-term investments and more concern about their employees than they've done before.
Okay, I got a couple more questions that came in online. This one, don't blame the messenger. It's tough, but it comes on the heels of maybe this last answer. Brad Levy says, is Wall Street made up of people or just monsters?
Oh, actually, as much as I really do get deeply angry about a lot of things that have happened, look, there are a lot of good folks. And I talk to people. This may shock you, it may shock others, who call me from Wall Street. Now, they say, I'm using a code name here, but who say, stay after them, because they understand that if we don't have markets with rules, everybody's going down. Yeah, you can live off sugar for a while, right? You can keep juicing those profits for a while, but you hollow out America's middle class, and the consequences for our economy and for our democracy are disaster. And there are folks who recognize that. The problem is right now, there's a real problem on Wall Street. These big companies figured out you could make an investment like go build a factory, and maybe it would pay off over the next 5 years or 50 years or whatever. Or you could spend half as much money and lobby Congress to give you just a little exception, just change the rule just a tiny little bit, or lobby one of the regulatory agencies and just get them, or lobby the White House to get a rule that's just a little bit. They invest now in making their influence felt in Washington. And you start out with a playing field like this and you tilt it just a little, and then just a little bit more, and then just a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, until we no longer have an economy, we no longer have a democracy that works.
We got a couple of questions that all relate to trade, so I'm going to combine them.
Okay.
President Trump has been very aggressive on trade and has talked about it in the context of trying to help workers. You have actually done the same in many ways. Is there any common ground between you on this issue?
So I thought there was, but it's kind of like Glass-Steagall. Candidate Trump was all in for Glass-Steagall. You may remember, Glass-Steagall was not only in the Democratic platform, it was in the Republican platform. And yet, President Trump never heard the words Glass-Steagall again, right? Same sort of thing on many of the things. Got to be out there for workers. And on trade, I don't think chaos is a plan. So yeah, there are a lot of things that we could do differently around trade policy, but you've got to have a plan. And I think the plan starts with a coherent vision, A, of how trade works, and B, who are your friends and who are not your friends. That's at least for me a good place to start with that.
Okay, final question.
Okay.
I really don't know the answer, but people want to know. Have you read the new Bob Woodward book?
Nope, not yet.
Are you planning to?
I don't know. God, this is painful. Look, this is our country. This is the President of the United States that we're talking about here. And every time you read one of these tweets calling people names, something that's ugly, something around trade it makes no sense, I don't take any pleasure in that.
Do you take the tweets personally, by the way? And what he says about you? The Pocahontas line and everything else?
No. You know, look, Donald Trump isn't going to change. But he's not going to change me either. My family's my family. I'm in the fights that I'm in, and I'm going to stay in them. But I stay in them not because of him. I stay in them because of the people I believe in and the urgency I feel in this moment. We have got to change the rules. This Congress rolling back regulations on the biggest financial institutions, rolling back regulations on Wall Street, this is absolutely the wrong direction for us to go.
I'm going to bring it back to where we started. If there was a crisis tomorrow, given the divide in Washington today, do you think we're prepared for that?
No, not even close.
Elizabeth Warren, everybody, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you very, very much.